On the 30th night, Vivienne Ashford walked into the workshop and found the vehicle that would decide an $80 million contract, still nothing more than an empty frame. She believed Caleb Vance had failed, and the board was prepared to sell the company at sunrise. But the single-father mechanic only locked the door, pulled the clock from the wall, and said he needed one night. By dawn, an engine that had never existed before roared to life. Then the display screen lit up with a single warning line. The person who had been sabotaging the project was standing in the room. Stay until the end to discover why Caleb hid his abilities and who wanted Ashford to fall. The test track at Greyhaven Industrial Park stretched 2 miles of engineered gradient and rough surface pavement designed to push prototype vehicles past the point of comfortable tolerance. On a gray Tuesday in late October, the Atlas X rolled out under overcast skies with representatives from the Federal Emergency Logistics Agency watching from a climate-controlled observation deck, clipboards in hand, and expectations running high. The vehicle had been built to haul near 10 metric tons across disaster terrain, to power a field hospital for 72 continuous hours, and to keep moving even when its onboard computers failed, a machine built for the worst conditions on Earth. For the first 40 minutes, it performed beyond projections, climbing the simulated debris ramp with measured authority, its power delivery smooth, its thermal readings sitting well inside acceptable range. Then it hit the second grade at full payload, and something changed. The sound appeared before anything visual registered, a high, thin shriek from deep inside the inverter housing, the kind of frequency that carries information if a person knows how to listen for it. The Atlas X shuddered once, lost traction tow across all four simultaneously, and locked itself to the pavement as smokes curled upward from the battery housing in slow, deliberate ribbons. The Federal observers stopped writing. The Ashford engineering team on the track floor broke into competing explanations before the vehicle had even fully stopped, some pointing at the thermal management stack, others blaming a calibration error in the torque distribution software, a few already pulling out laptops as though the answer lived in a line of code somewhere accessible. The vehicle was pulled from the grade and towed back toward the service entrance, passing a row of unassuming buildings at the edge of the industrial district, one of which bore a hand-lettered sign that read Vance Auto and Electric. Caleb Vance was replacing a wheel bearing on a delivery truck when the Atlas X rolled past his open bay doors, and he set down his wrench without being asked. He did not look at the chassis or the cooling vents or the damage scorched into the undercarriage. He listened, standing completely still with his arms at his sides, head tilted slightly the way a person tilts toward a sound they recognize from a long time ago. The inverter was cycling between two instructions at the same time, he said, not loud enough to be performing for anyone, but loud enough that Maya Sloan, who had climbed out of the trailing support vehicle, could hear him clearly. Maya was the battery systems lead for Atlas X, 34 years old and the most credentialed engineer on the project, and her first reaction was dismissal, because nothing about the man standing in that open garage suggested he had clearance to analyze proprietary drivetrain architecture. She said as much, in professional language that carried a clear edge, and Caleb did not argue. He reached into his shirt pocket, produced a coin, and set it flat on the exposed frame rail of the Atlas X at the precise spot where the inverter housing met the mounting bracket. He asked her to watch the coin when the vehicle was started. When the engine cycled, the coin skipped at a specific frequency, exactly at the millisecond interval when the control system transitioned between operating modes, proving that the conflict was not software corruption, but a structural timing mismatch between two command architectures running in parallel. Maya stood very still and said nothing for a long moment. Vivienne Ashford arrived 12 minutes later, having been called from a board meeting she had not wanted to leave. She watched Caleb isolate a secondary control relay, disable it manually with a tool he had borrowed without asking, and restore the Atlas X to limited mobility in 22 minutes. The fix was mechanical, clean, and undeniably effective. Caleb handed the relay back to a junior technician, wiped his hands on a rag, and told Vivienne without inflection that the vehicle was not broken. It was being commanded to fail. When she asked where he had worked before, he said only that the company had been acquired by Ashford 12 years ago. The boardroom on the 31st floor of Ashford Automotive's Greyhaven headquarters had windows that faced Lake Iroquois, and on clear mornings the water turned the color of brushed steel, cold and without warmth. It was not a clear morning when the emergency session convened 2 days after the Atlas X failure, and the sky outside was the same flat gray as the faces around the conference table. The board's position was straightforward. The Atlas X program had consumed 43 months and $62 million of the company's capital. The federal demonstration window was almost closed, and continuing to pour resources into a prototype that self-destructed under basic operational load was not a sustainable strategy. Grant Kingsley, vice president of strategy and the board's most persuasive voice, laid out a proposal to transfer the electric vehicle division and its associated patents to a consortium of what he called aligned industry partners, at a price that would preserve Ashford's core operations and protect shareholder equity. He presented the numbers with the practiced confidence of someone who had already made the decision privately. Vivienne brought Caleb into the session unannounced. He arrived in the same work clothes he had worn at the test track, carrying nothing, and took a seat at the far end of the table without introduction. The engineers in the room had graduate degrees from institutions whose names carried significant weight, and several of them had already submitted competing theories about the Atlas X failure in written reports that ran to dozens of pages. Caleb listened to those theories for approximately 8 minutes, before stating that adding more battery capacity would not solve the problem, and rewriting the torque distribution code would not solve the problem, because both approaches assumed the architecture was fundamentally sound when in fact the entire drivetrain layout needed to be reorganized from the structural level up. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when an uninvited person says something that cannot be immediately dismissed. One of the senior directors leaned forward and asked, with a tone that carried more than professional skepticism, how long it would take a garage owner to accomplish what a team of 140 credentialed engineers had been unable to achieve in 3.5 years. Caleb said 30 days. The number was not a boast and it was not a joke, and the silence that followed it was different from the silence that had come before. Harder, more uncertain, carrying a question no one in the room was quite prepared to ask directly. Vivienne looked at him across the length of the table and asked if he needed anything to begin. He asked for a test bay, the Atlas X frame, and access to existing inventory. He asked for Maya Sloan and for a machinist named Elliot Rowe, who was currently on the company's involuntary separation list. He did not ask for a budget, a project coordinator, or a software development team. Vivienne authorized the resources before the meeting had formally adjourned, and Grant Kingsley expressed his support with the smooth efficiency of someone who had already calculated the odds of failure and found them acceptable. The terms were simple. If Caleb delivered a functioning prototype that met federal specifications within 30 days, Ashford would retain the contract and the division. If he failed, Vivienne would accept the board's recommendation and close the program. Grant requested that the security department maintain comprehensive documentation of all activity in the test bay, and Vivienne did not object. That afternoon, Caleb walked into a bay stocked with millions of dollars in precision equipment, stood in the center of it for a long moment, and asked to have the existing drivetrain removed from the Atlas X frame entirely. For 7 days, Caleb Vance did not install a single component. The engineering staff in the adjacent bays watched through the internal windows and cataloged what they saw: an older man driving worn test vehicles around the facility's interior circuit at low speed, holding a small digital recorder against the door frame while the engine ran, pressing the flat of his palm against hood surfaces to read thermal transfer patterns that no sensor array had been positioned to capture. He collected parts from the salvage designation bins, components that had been formally written off as incompatible or superseded, and arranged them on a long work table without apparent system, the way a person assembles a puzzle before understanding its image. The informal name that spread through the engineering department for the space he occupied was the junkyard. Grant Kingsley made certain that Vivienne received photographs of the empty Atlas X frame each morning, delivered with brief, neutral commentary about project timelines and board obligations. The frame was not empty because Caleb was failing. It was empty because he was disassembling the problem into components small enough to test in isolation, in locations separated by enough distance that no single observation point could understand what was being built. A supercapacitor array was installed inside a test fixture labeled as a load measurement device. A cooling architecture was bolted onto an aging industrial forklift and run continuously in the far corner of the bay, logging heat data for days, and a torque management controller was assembled in Elliott's personal machine shop 2 miles from the Ashford campus and tested against a salvaged commercial drivetrain that bore no visible resemblance to Atlas X hardware. Maya was the first person inside Ashford's engineering structure who understood what the individual modules were capable of. She had been assigned to monitor Caleb's progress as much as assist it, and she had been skeptical in the particular way trained engineers are skeptical of intuitive approaches, not dismissively, but with the quiet certainty that rigor and processes were the only reliable path to results that held under real conditions. What she observed instead was that each isolated component Caleb had built not only functioned but exceeded the performance benchmarks Atlas X had never reached in its integrated form, and the discrepancy between those results and the assembled prototype's failures pointed at a conclusion she had not been prepared to reach. She asked why the modules had not been brought together, and Caleb gave her an answer she had not expected. Every time the Atlas X prototype had approached operational stability during earlier testing phases, the vehicle had received a firmware update not listed on any approved maintenance schedule, and each update had adjusted thermal limits by a margin too small to flag automatically but sufficient to ensure the system would fail under sustained load. If the completed BridgeDrive architecture was installed and visible to the monitoring infrastructure before Caleb was ready to reveal it, the person responsible for the updates would know precisely which element to alter. He was protecting the design by keeping it invisible until the moment it could no longer be sabotaged effectively. Avery called her father that evening while he was eating at the bay workbench, because it was the only time he had, and she asked why he had spent 12 years building a reputation as a mechanic when anyone who watched him work could see he was doing something that went well past mechanical. Caleb said that reputation was what people handed you when they needed to put you somewhere they could understand, and that it had never fixed a single broken machine. He said he had made a decision about what mattered more, and he had not regretted it for a single day, even the difficult ones. Maya found the unauthorized firmware update that same night, buried inside a routine diagnostic package, signed with authentication credentials that traced to board-level administrative access. Vivienne Ashford did not ask questions publicly when she began pulling archive files from the records vault on the 22nd floor. She had given her administrative assistant a list of acquisition documents and merger records from more than a decade back, and she worked through them alone in the evenings after the building had mostly emptied, cross-referencing patent registrations against the personnel files from companies that Ashford had absorbed during its expansion period. The name she was looking for appeared on 3 separate patent filings under the Northline Systems corporate header, a dual-circuit drivetrain architecture that described the core principles of what Caleb had built in that test bay with such structural clarity that the documents read not like early research, but like a completed theory waiting for someone to build it. Ashford had purchased Northline Systems and its intellectual property portfolio in a deal finalized 12 years earlier. The lead inventor listed on the most significant of those patents was Caleb Vance, whose name appeared nowhere in any subsequent internal documentation, whose design had been formally classified as non-viable by the engineering integration team following the acquisition, and who had apparently ceased to exist as far as Ashford's institutional memory was concerned. Vivienne pulled his original personnel file from the Northline records and found a note from the integration assessment. The inventor had declined a technical directorship offer and had not been retained. Elliot told Vivienne what the personnel file could not when she found him alone in the machine shop the following afternoon. He said that Caleb had been the most gifted drivetrain architect Northline had ever employed, that the technical directorship offer had been genuine, and that Caleb had turned it down 2 weeks after his wife's death because Avery was 8 years old, and there was no one else to raise her. Grant Kingsley had overseen the Northline acquisition from the strategic side, and it had been Grant's recommendation that Caleb's dual-circuit patent be shelved in favor of a simpler integration approach that required less investment to bring to market. The patent had been purchased, classified, and effectively buried, and Caleb had opened a garage. Vivienne went to the test bay that evening and confronted Caleb directly. She said he had withheld information material to the project and that she deserved to understand the full context of what she had hired him to do. Caleb looked at her for a moment without expression and said she had brought him in to solve an engineering problem, not to provide a corporate history lesson, and that he was solving the engineering problem. The exchange was precise and cool, and left both of them in a position neither entirely wanted, Vivienne feeling that she had been managed rather than trust-thirsted, Caleb certain that her concern was for the company's contract rather than for the years the company had spent making his work invisible. Meanwhile, Grant moved deliberately through the company's internal networks, circulating a narrative among the board members he controlled most reliably, that Vivienne had handed the company's most critical active project to a man with no current credentials, no institutional affiliation, and no accountability to the organization's engineering governance structure. The cracks in shareholder confidence widened, and Grant used the momentum to position his acquisition offer as responsible contingency planning rather than opportunism. Maya brought her analysis of the unauthorized update to Caleb's workbench late that night and placed a printed log beside his coffee. The access trail was not long or complicated. The server that had signed the firmware modification was registered to a rack of equipment on the 14th floor. Inside a suite of offices that belonged to Grant Kingsley's Strategic Affairs Department, and the timestamp placed it 3 hours before the last Atlas X test failure. The federal liaison contacted Ashford's project office on a Wednesday morning and informed them in neutral bureaucratic language that the agency's scheduling requirements had shifted. The final demonstration window was being moved forward by 2 days to accommodate a competing evaluation on the Eastern deployment calendar, which meant Ashford now had 10 days instead of 12, and the countdown that had already felt uncomfortably tight became something close to a controlled emergency. Grant absorbed the news without visible reaction and, within the hour, had drafted a procedural motion requesting that the board convene an emergency session to address the prototype's failure to achieve measurable progress, citing the new timeline as evidence that continued investment in the test bay represented an unacceptable fiduciary risk. Vivienne drove to the bay herself rather than calling. She walked the perimeter of the empty Atlas X frame in silence, looked at the organized surfaces of Caleb's work table, and told him that she could not defend a project that produced no visible output with 10 days remaining. She asked him to begin assembly. Caleb said no, not with anger and not with apology, but as a structural fact, the way he might tell someone that a specific bolt pattern would not hold a specific load, regardless of how much force was applied to the wrench. The saboteur was still monitoring the bay, and the moment an integrated drivetrain appeared in that frame, the window for surgical interference would open. Vivienne told him she would terminate the project. Caleb moved to the workbench and placed 3 data tablets in front of her, each displaying performance logs from a separate module, sustained towing load data that Atlas X had never achieved in any prior test, thermal readings from the cooling system under 3 hours of maximum continuous output, and torque response metrics that remained stable after simulated computer system failures. He walked her through what each module was capable of, without describing how they would be assembled of, or what they would look like in combination. And when she asked why he would not simply trust her with the full design, he reminded her that every piece of information held inside Ashford's management layer was accessible to Grant Kingsley. Grant made an approach to Maya 3 days later, timed for an evening when Caleb had left the bay briefly. He was not hostile or overtly corrupt in his presentation. He framed the conversation in terms of professional futures, noting that a vice president of engineering role would be available following the restructuring he was anticipating, and that her credentials placed her well above her current supporting position. He asked if she could provide him with a structural overview of what Caleb was building. Maya told him she would need a few days to consider the offer carefully, and went back to her workbench and wrote down every word of the conversation. That same night, Caleb's phone showed a notice from the commercial lender holding the lease on Vance Auto and Electric, stating that the loan servicing agreement had been transferred to a new holding entity, and that the outstanding balance was being called in full within 30 days. Caleb traced the holding entity through publicly available corporate filings in 2 hours, following a chain of 3 registered agents before arriving at a law firm that handled financial transactions for the Kingsley family office. A sealed envelope arrived at the garage the following morning, addressed in clean block letters. Inside was a blank check drawn on a private account and a handwritten note on plain stock: "Leave Ashford before the 30th day." Caleb showed the envelope to no one outside the three of them. He set it on the work table, looked at it for a long moment with the same stillness he had shown on the test track, and then told Maya and Elliot they were going to build a trap. Not the kind that announced itself or invited confrontation, but the kind that operated quietly in the background and recorded everything, the way a good diagnostic system recorded everything, without interfering with the process it was observing. They constructed an independent data logging architecture that ran on hardware completely isolated from Ashford's network infrastructure, powered by its own supply, logging every access event with a timestamp, device signature, and authentication token. Into the monitoring data that the company's security system could observe, they introduced a false configuration profile for the Atlas X. Something that would appear to a sophisticated observer to be a conventional drivetrain layout moving toward final assembly, the kind of setup that would require a specific type of intervention to disable, and that would reveal precisely what tools the saboteur had available and how they intended to use them. While Caleb set the trap, Vivienne followed a thread that had begun in the archive documents and had not released its hold on her attention. Grant had been the architect of the Northline acquisition, and the terms of that deal had been structured in a way that benefited a specific set of technology investors who had received early notification of the purchase before it was publicly disclosed. Those same investors appeared in the ownership structure of three component suppliers, currently holding exclusive contracts with Ashford Automotive, supplying parts at pricing that sat conspicuously above market rate for equivalent specifications. The arithmetic was not difficult to follow once the right documents were placed beside each other. Ashford paid inflated prices. The inflated margins flowed to the investment structure, and the investment structure paid out to the same family relationships Grant had been cultivating for 2 decades. Caleb and Vivienne sat across from each other at the workbench for the first time, without the structure of professional distance between them, and Caleb showed her the BridgeDrive schematic. It was not a single innovation but a logical architecture. 2 independent energy circuits that shared mechanical coordination but maintained electrical separation, so that a software attack on one circuit left the second fully operational, capable of moving the vehicle at reduced but functional capacity through a mechanical management overlay that required no computer instruction to perform. The design eliminated the single point of failure that every sabotage attempt had been targeting, not by hardening the software, but by making software authority structurally irrelevant to the vehicle's ability to move. Vivienne understood immediately that the implications extended far past the federal contract. Any vehicle operating in environments where communications could be jammed or corrupted, any platform that needed to function after a cyber attack on its management systems, would benefit from the same principle. And she said this not as enthusiasm for revenue, but as recognition that the company she'd been fighting to protect was built on top of something that mattered considerably more than she had understood when the fight began. Caleb asked her to hold the complete BridgeDrive architecture in confidence until the final night. If Grant understood that the design was immune to remote intervention, he would move the conflict from technical sabotage to legal obstruction, and the mechanisms available to a man with his financial resources in that territory were significantly harder to counter than a firmware update. Vivienne agreed and left the bay that night, carrying the weight of information she could not yet act on. 2 days later, Grant announced that the board would conduct a formal inventory of the test bay's contents on the morning of the 29th day. The inventory team arrived at 7 in the morning, 4 people with clipboards and a mandate from the board's audit committee, and they documented what they found with thorough and unhurried attention. 1 Atlas X chassis frame, unmodified and empty, an array of diagnostic and testing equipment that corresponded to its listed purpose, several benches of salvage Cater components with no clear integration pathway, and 1 machinist's tool set of standard commercial grade. They spent 90 minutes in the bay and departed with a report confirming the project had produced no integrated prototype and showed no trajectory toward producing one. Grant received the report before noon and circulated it to 4 board members with a brief notation that the evidence supported immediate project termination. At the afternoon board session, Vivienne defended the project with the only argument she had available: that the test bay results were preliminary and that the contractor had demonstrated module-level performance exceeding specifications. Grant placed the inventory photographs on the conference screen and asked the assembled board members what they believed a company, facing a 10-day deadline, could reasonably accomplish with an empty frame and scattered salvage parts. Several board members, who had remained neutral, began shifting toward his position. Caleb sat against the wall and said nothing in his own defense, which Vivienne found harder to explain than an outright argument would have been. The inventory photographs reached a financial news service through a source inside the building by 4 that afternoon, framed as evidence of executive mismanagement and due diligence failure. Ashford's stock moved downward with a momentum that suggested the information had been deployed with timing in mind. Grant walked the trading floor response data into the board session the following morning and introduced a formal acquisition proposal from Hawthorne Consolidated, a private investment group with enough capital to stabilize Ashford's balance sheet, structured around terms that would preserve the current management team in operational roles, meaning Grant would retain his position while the Ashford family's controlling interest was dissolved. That evening, Grant found Caleb in the equipment parking area behind the Bay building, alone, and he spoke plainly in the way powerful men sometimes do when they believe the outcome is already settled. He acknowledged that he had been the one to recommend shelving the Northline patents after the acquisition, and he offered his reasoning without apology. The market did not reward the best solution at any given moment. It rewarded the solution that could be controlled and timed, and Caleb's dual-circuit architecture had been too difficult to time because it was too good too quickly. He said this as if it were wisdom rather than admission, and Caleb listened to all of it without expression. The recorder in his shirt pocket was running. Grant did not confess to the firmware interventions or the false update packages. He acknowledged the garage loan purchase as a legitimate financial transaction and offered Caleb a number that was, by any reasonable standard of the life Caleb currently lived, a significant sum, enough to clear the property debt, sustain Avery's education, and leave the city without visible hardship. He told Caleb that the 30th day was a formality, and that the morning after would proceed the same way whether Caleb was present or not. Caleb said that the fundamental error in Grant's model was the assumption that everyone had a price at which their decision-making could be purchased, and that the error was not moral but analytical. It caused a strategist to consistently underestimate the behavior of people who had already decided what they would not trade. Grant walked away without responding. After dark, a sequence of vehicles moved through Greyhaven's industrial district, with a quiet routine of ordinary traffic, a panel truck, a flatbed, a courier van, each carrying equipment that had been stored, tested, and documented in locations distributed across the city, none of which had appeared in any Ashford inventory. The modules arrived one at a time. Maya brought the controller housing. Elliot arrived with the mechanical cut-off assembly wrapped in moving blankets, and the components that had spent weeks disguised as unrelated industrial equipment began to reveal their actual nature. Vivienne walked into the bay at 8 in the evening and saw the Atlas X frame exactly as the inventory team had documented it. Empty. Caleb looked at her without urgency, pulled the clock from the wall, set it face down on the bench, and said that she had given him 30 days to understand the vehicle. He only needed one night to put it together. The assembly did not look like anything that would ever appear in a promotional production about automotive engineering. It was 4 people in a locked bay, working under fluorescent light, moving through a sequence of steps that had been rehearsed mentally for weeks, but never physically, because the entire logic of the plan had required that the full system never exist in one location until the moment it needed to exist completely. Elliot bolted the mechanical cut-off assembly to the drive shaft with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years understanding exactly what tolerance meant at the mechanical level, and who treated every fastener as though it would be the one that held under conditions no test had fully anticipated. Maya ran the dual-circuit wiring with a concentration that converted the bay into silence, each connection checked against a laminated schematic she had memorized well enough to not need but kept beside her as a form of discipline. Caleb installed the BridgeDrive coordinator at the structural center of the drivetrain with his hands and without instrumentation, fitting it by feel into a position that had been engineered to accept it through 12 years of accumulated knowledge about what the design required. Vivienne, who had arrived expecting to observe, found herself handed a parts list and directed to a storage cabinet, and she located what was needed and delivered it without ceremony because the work required exactly that. The first start attempt came at 11:40 in the evening. The inverters fired, the circuits initialized, and then the system shut itself down in a cascade fault that threw error codes across 3 diagnostic screens simultaneously. Maya read the codes without speaking and began tracing them backward through the logic chain, determining within 20 minutes that the issue was not software and not hardware but geometry. The 2 cable runs connecting the independent circuits to the coordinator were different lengths by a distance measurable in centimeters, and the signal delay produced by that difference was creating an echo in the synchronization protocol that the system interpreted as a conflict instruction. She said they would need to rewrite the synchronization timing parameters, which was 4 hours of software work they did not have. Caleb looked at the cable runs for a long moment, asked for a measuring tape, confirmed the differential, and moved the coordinator mounting position 3 centimeters toward the longer cable run, equalizing the signal path through physical repositioning instead of code revision. The diagnostic screens cleared. The second start attempt, at 12:47 in the morning, brought the Atlas X to full operational state. All systems initialized, drive ready, thermal readings within normal range across both circuits, and for approximately 30 seconds no one in the bay spoke. The load tests that followed revealed a second problem. When the vehicle accepted simulated towing weight and the system entered sustained high-demand mode, temperature readings in the primary cooling circuit began climbing at a rate that would exceed operational limits within 40 minutes. Caleb pulled the cooling circuit schematics and identified a valve in the thermal management flow path, whose specifications did not match the installation record. A component that had been replaced at some point after the original build without documentation, using a part rated for a lower flow volume. Elliot took the valve to the small lathe in the bay's equipment corner and machined a replacement from raw stock, working from memory and calipers, finishing in 38 minutes while Maya monitored the temperature logs. Caleb traced the replacement authorization backward through the service records. The signature belonged to a maintenance account in Grant Kingsley's department, time-stamped 3 weeks prior. Elliot installed the machined valve, the cooling circuit stabilized, and the temperature readings fell back into range and held there. At 4:47 in the morning, Atlas X moved under its own power for the first time, rolling the length of the bay floor with a drive train that was nearly silent, not the quiet of a system straining to suppress noise, but the quiet of components working in alignment, nothing fighting anything. Every element performing the function it had been built to perform. Caleb brought the vehicle to a stop, shut down the primary circuit manually, and watched the BridgeDrive coordinator transfer authority to the secondary circuit without interruption, the vehicle remaining fully operational under backup power. A remote shutdown command arrived at 5:14. The primary circuit received it, acknowledged it, and ceased function. The secondary circuit continued without pause, and the data logger recorded the command's origin. A device registered to Grant Kingsley, operating from within the Ashford campus network. Grant had entered the building, and he was walking toward the bay. Grant arrived with 3 board members he had assembled on short notice, presenting the pre-dawn gathering as a concern for proper process. He wanted independent witnesses present when the project formally failed to produce a viable prototype before the demonstration deadline. He stepped into the bay and encountered instead a fully assembled, operational Atlas X with 4 people standing beside it and a data display showing a remote shutdown attempt logged 7 minutes earlier. His recovery was immediate and composed, the response of a man who had navigated unfavorable circumstances before. The equipment registered to his name had been accessed without his authorization. The log was the product of a security breach rather than personal conduct, and the entire demonstration sequence should be halted until a proper chain of custody could be established for the Atlas X hardware. Vivienne invoked her executive authority as CEO and directed the demonstration to proceed, accepting personal liability for the outcome in writing on a document she had prepared the previous day. The federal liaison, who had arrived early and was waiting in the observation area, confirmed that the agency's evaluation team was present and the window was open. Grant filed a procedural objection that he was legally entitled to file, and it was formally noted and set aside. The evaluation required 3 sequential demonstrations. The first placed Atlas X on the facility's towing course with a loaded trailer representing approximately 9.8 metric tons of resistance, and the vehicle climbed the primary grade and the secondary switchback without hesitation, traction holding through both elevation changes, thermal data remaining stable throughout. The second test placed the vehicle in the facility's thermal chamber at sustained high-temperature operation for 2 hours under continuous power draw, simulating the output requirements of a mobile emergency generation station, and Atlas X held its operating parameters without interruption. The federal evaluators made notes and conferred in low voices that carried no particular legible tone. The third test required the vehicle to continue operating after a simulated total failure of its central computer management system. Before the Ashford technician reached the control interface to initiate the controlled shutdown, Grant accessed a residual administrative credential he had retained without disclosing to the IT governance team and pushed a hard lock command through the vehicle's emergency management channel. A significantly more aggressive intervention than a controlled shutdown, one designed to prevent reinitialization. The primary display screen went dark, and every indicator on the vehicle's dashboard extinguished simultaneously. BridgeDrive registered the circuit failure in the primary system and transferred complete operational authority to the secondary circuit in a time interval too small to be observable as a pause. The mechanical management overlay, which required no computational instruction to function, assumed torque coordination. Caleb shifted the vehicle into drive and moved it forward at reduced but fully controlled speed, completed the required distance, and brought it to a stop precisely at the evaluation marker. The secondary circuit's operational log had recorded every millisecond of the transition, and the data logger had recorded simultaneously the origin of the hard lock command, the credential used, the timestamp, and the network path, all of which confirmed that Grant Kingsley had executed an unauthorized intervention against a vehicle undergoing federal evaluation. Vivienne placed the complete sabotage documentation before the board members who had accompanied Grant. The firmware update logs, the component replacement authorization, the garage loan acquisition, the false inventory timing, and the hard lock event from 20 minutes prior. She added the corporate structure diagram showing the supplier relationships between Ashford's parts vendors and the Kingsley family investment accounts. The board members read what they were given with the careful attention of people who understood that their names were adjacent to these documents and who needed to be clear about where their decisions would place them on the record. Grant was formally suspended from all company roles before the federal liaison had left the building. The agency representative confirmed Atlas X had met every performance criterion and extended the program contract at the full value of $80 million. When a journalist who had arrived at the facility asked Caleb how long it had taken to build the vehicle, he said it had taken one night to assemble it and 12 years to understand why it needed to exist. The offer Vivienne made was genuine and significant. Chief Technology Officer of Ashford Automotive, a role with salary, equity, institutional authority, and the kind of formal recognition that the company had quietly owed him since the day it purchased Northline Systems. Caleb declined it before she had finished the sentence, and the board members still in the room looked at each other the way people look at someone who has just refused something they cannot imagine refusing. He was not performing humility or punishing the company. He simply had a specific idea of what he wanted to build, and it did not fit inside the structure she was offering. What he proposed instead was a research unit housed in the former Northline manufacturing facility, which Ashford still owned and had been using for parts storage. The unit would operate with direct access to the company's component inventory and testing infrastructure, but its design process would be structured around integration between engineering, fabrication, and production, not as separate departments with formal handoffs, but as a single working group, where the machinist and the systems engineer were in the same room making decisions about the same problem at the same time. Caleb wanted the people who understood how a part behaved under stress to be present when the people who designed the part were deciding what it needed to do. Vivienne agreed to terms that included a co-ownership arrangement for BridgeDrive an equity position for Caleb in the new unit, and a direct line to the company's production planning, so that the gap between prototype and manufactured product would be measured in months rather than years. Elliot Rowe was named lead of fabrication operations before the paperwork was complete. His removal from the involuntary separation list was the correction of an error that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention, and Vivienne acknowledged as much without being asked. Maya Sloan took the architecture role for energy systems across Ashford's entire next-generation line, which was what her capabilities had warranted for years, and what the company's organizational structure had consistently failed to reflect. Vance Auto and Electric remained open on the south side of Greyhaven. Caleb did not close it or relocate it, or convert it into something with a better sign and a cleaner floor. It stayed exactly as it was, because it was where he had always been able to work on something small enough to test completely before committing to anything large, and that function had not become less valuable because the scale of his other work had grown. Avery came to the North Line building on the first working day and walked the floor while her father explained what would be built there. She stopped at the wall where a framed print of the BridgeDrive patent had been mounted, saw his name listed as inventor alongside Maya's, and asked if this time he would let people know what he had made. Caleb said he did not need people to know how capable he was. What he needed was for the people who made things to stop being written out of the record of what they had made. Vivienne arrived later that morning in work clothes, rather than the suit she had worn to every interaction before, carrying printed schematics for the next Atlas iteration rolled under her arm. The relationship between them had not resolved into something warmer than mutual respect, but it had settled into something more durable. The understanding that they could work beside each other toward a thing that mattered without needing it to be anything more than that. When the building's main lights came on, and the floor was ready to receive its first day's work, Vivienne looked at the empty bays along the north wall and asked Caleb how long the next vehicle would take. He studied the drawings in her hand and answered without hesitation. This time, they were not going to wait until the last night to begin.